Good evening and welcome. My name is Rose Dahlan. I'm the Change and Engagement Manager from the Climate Change Transformation Team. And welcome to our fifth Net Zero Isle of Man Together for Our Planet webinar series, organized to run at the same time as COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow at the moment. Some housekeeping before we start. This session is recorded, and we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel, website, social media. So if you don't like your faces to be on the recording, please turn off your video and you can still participate in the workshop today. This evening will be an interactive workshop, so there will be opportunities to ask questions throughout the session. So there won't be a Q&A at the end. You can ask questions during the workshop. And as we are all perhaps at home, can you please turn off your mic during the event to minimize any disruptions? So COP26, UN Conference of Parties, an important climate change summit, started last week in Glasgow, where global leaders discuss how to tackle climate change. The summit will be closing in the next few days. And I think yesterday, the first draft of agreement was released. So it's likely that decisions made there this week will lead to major changes in our daily lives. So it is how important COP26 is. That's why Net Zero Isle of Man has been working with stakeholders to bring a program of event for residents on island to raise awareness of COP26 and also the importance of local climate action. So the importance of how we as individuals and communities can ourselves do to tackle climate change. And the presentation today, or the workshop today, is part of that program of events. And we're very pleased to have with us a guest speaker, Rebecca Nestor. She is an experienced psychologist and a board member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. And tonight she'll be talking about talking climate change. So climate change is, as we all know, is a pressing issue of our time, but talking about climate change is really important. The more aware and educated we are, the more we can prepare ourselves for the future or take actions to reduce our personal emissions. But it's an emotional subject because people have lots of different views about it. So how do we initiate and sustain conversations on climate change? So we're very lucky this evening. Rebecca will share with us ways on how we can build our own confidence in opening up conversations on climate change and to communicate effectively on the subject. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic on to Rebecca. And Rebecca.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Rose. What a great introduction. And it's lovely to be here. Welcome to everyone. It would be really lovely as well if we could all introduce ourselves. Now, clearly, we don't have time for everybody to speak, but if you could put in the chat your name and where you're calling in from and what's prompted you to come along tonight, that will really help me to focus what we talk about, and it will also give us a way of modelling the interactive nature of this workshop, which I hope we're going to be experiencing throughout. So as Rose says, I'm from the Climate Psychology Alliance. I'm also, somebody who's been concerned and worried about climate change for about the last 10 or 15 years. And I've always found it really difficult to talk to my friends, colleagues, relations, especially relations, about the climate crisis. There are all sorts of reasons why I find it difficult, and I think we all have different reasons why it might be a bit of a challenge. And so what I want to do tonight, and Ali, perhaps we could have the next slide and then immediately the one after that. What I'd like to do tonight, thank you, is to explore, using some tools from psychology and psychotherapy in particular, ways of understanding what goes on under the surface in conversations, which is what makes conversations meaningful and important, but it's also the things that can be going on are sometimes what makes it difficult to talk about important things like the climate. And we'll explore these, and there'll be an opportunity to kind of reflect and if you like, practice yourself. And the idea is that at the end of the workshop, we may all feel a bit more confident in having these climate conversations, which, as Rose says, they're really important, because the more we talk about important issues, the more we feel that it's kind of possible to think about it, possible to imagine maybe a different future. And climate change, I think, has been a little bit of a taboo, and so these ideas are designed in part to break the taboo. So in the first half, we'll explore some of the things that are going on in climate conversations, what goes on in conversations generally, what might be a successful climate conversation, what we might mean by that, and what we are ourselves intending as we come into a climate conversation, both consciously and perhaps less consciously. And then in the second half, we'll explore in a bit more detail what we can do to make the conversations more successful, at least to come out of them feeling that we've managed to have a conversation, which for many of us is often not the case. And we'll have a chance to practice with some of the tools, and that whether you take part in that practice is of course entirely up to you. It's a decision that you make. I want to acknowledge the important contribution that Climate Outreach make to this workshop, and also Rosemary Randall, who is a well-established climate psychologist who helped me, mentored me to put these materials together in the first place. It won't be a complete kind of quick fix. It's an opening up, it's an exploration of some of these ideas, and I hope that you'll be able to follow up some of the resources that I'll be offering right at the end, to do a bit more reading and maybe to do a bit of practice, perhaps kind of more privately than in this workshop. So if we could start by a little bit of personal reflection, and again, if you want to put this in the chat, that would be great. Could we have the next slide, please, Ali? So, thinking about controversial conversations, conversations that are maybe a bit intense, where you know there might be different views. What's this like for you? Are you the kind of person who goes, yeah, bring it on, I really like all this kind of debate and discussion, and disagreement is fine, so you kind of bring on the heat? Or are you someone perhaps a bit more kind of like, oh, that's a bit anxious, I don't really like that, please don't let's get into a disagreement? So thinking about this as a scale of 1 to 10, or if you like a kind of virtual lineup, 1 at the one end of the scale is no heat, and the 10 at the other end of the scale is as much heat as you like, bring it on. So if you want to just put in the chat, you know, a number that reflects where you might be if we were doing this in person, I'd be asking you to stand up and position yourselves in the room, but we can't do that. So are you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10? Okay, so we've got a 6, we've got a 3, we've got an 8. We've got lots of people with some kind of pretty high numbers there. So I'm going to invite anyone who has put a relatively low number to just come forward and say something about why that number. What's the what's your experience of controversial conversations? I'm not going to pick on anybody, but I can see that we have somebody with a 3, somebody with a 5. Just come forward, unmute yourself. Why that number?
Hi, in the absence of anyone else speaking, it's Rob. I'm sort of in the middle. Like, I don't mind taking on the argument, but I try to keep things a bit more neutral, and probably wouldn't seek out conflict if I could. Thank you.
You're not looking for it. Thank you, Rob. That's great. But it's kind of like, if it happens, it might be all right. That sounds as if that's
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Anybody else with a different perspective? For example, for me, I would probably have put about a 3. It's not that I don't it's not that I don't like different views. What I really don't like is conflict, and I don't like the idea of people around me getting into conflict, which, you know, comes from my childhood. parents arguing, oh God, no, please make it go away. And so any kind of threat of conflict for me is a problem. And so I'm likely to be kind of around about the 3. There's also maybe a question of like, it depends. So like, it depends on the topic, or it depends who we're talking with. So maybe if anybody's got particular situations in which they're more comfortable with heat, particular situations in which you're less comfortable, maybe you'd like to unmute and speak. I can see there's a really helpful comment there that in the heat of the moment, it's hard to kind of find the words, isn't it? That's I have that too. So, but those of us who kind of enjoy putting things into words and enjoy articulating stuff may actually kind of, really enjoy those kinds of conversations. Anybody else got a different perspective?
I'm happy to talk, Rebecca. So for me, the conversation that I find the most difficult are the ones that I feel very passionate about. So it could be something around equality and LGBTQ, or it could be things to do with like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. And I get very, very emotional about those subjects. So if there's a conversation around them, I find myself heating up very quickly. Whereas if it's something that I'm less sort of emotive about and less passionate about, then I'm quite comfortable in having those conversations. So I think there's a level of like emotion depending on how your own values and how important they are to you.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Perhaps climate is for many of us is one of those subjects that is particularly difficult. We may fear that the other person will not agree with our perspective, or won't think that climate is as concerning as we think it is. There's some interesting research, particularly with young people, which found that most young people, the vast majority of young people, are really concerned about climate change, and also the vast majority of young people think that most other young people are not as concerned as they are, and so there's this kind of silencing effect of that, because if I bring it in, what other people will just think I'm stupid, or weird, or some kind of environmentalist. And there's the issues there about, I think, identity. And as one person has mentioned in the chat, that it is sometimes a question of whether you're anxious about losing face. So is it going to embarrass me? Is it going to humiliate me? And then I withdraw. Thank you for that comment. So if we could have a look at the next slide, please, Ali, because I think one of the things that may make things difficult for us if we are a bit anxious about heat in conversations is that we might think, well, I'm not even going to start, because the conversation might get very intense. Whereas actually, what the climate outreach research is suggesting is that any conversation about the climate is better than no conversation. In other words, you could just say, "Oh, climate change," and that would be better than not saying anything. And you don't need to take the conversation any further if you don't feel up to it, or you're anxious about what might happen. So what we've got on this slide is the idea that a successful climate conversation could be anything from shallow, just mentioning climate change, which would be the kind of level 1, up through an exchange that you mention it, the other person responds, an exploration where there's a bit of toing and froing, but perhaps it's still at a surface level. But for people who are not used to having any conversations about climate because their friends don't talk about it at all, that kind of exploration is quite meaningful, in fact. It breaks the taboo, as I was saying earlier. So you could go up from that to a more meaningful exchange, which is deep, which brings in perhaps your feelings, their feelings, and through to a shift, the kind of deep exchange and a shift in other people's and our own levels of concern or awareness or knowledge. And the shift can be both sides. You know, it's one of the things that I think we may struggle with is the idea that we've got to change other people's minds, whereas in fact perhaps what's needed is a willingness to have our own minds changed as well. I don't mean to be suddenly told that climate change isn't happening or that kind of thing, but just that there's so much to know in climate change, and being able to explore it with others can be very powerful. But for those of us who are not comfortable with intense conversations, being aware that it's possible just to bring climate change into the conversation with a couple of words may help. So that's the first takeaway from today, is don't avoid talking about it because you think it will get intense. It doesn't need to get intense. So what I would like to invite you to do now is to just take a moment privately and sorry, Ali, if we could have the next slide. And this will be, the slide is inviting you to do this with another person, but we don't have the technology for that tonight. So I'm just going to ask you to do it privately. But just take a few minutes, 5 minutes, to remember a difficult conversation or exchange that you've had about the climate crisis. It doesn't matter why it was difficult. And you might want to think, what were the difficulties? But try to remember some details of the conversation. How did you feel? What were the feelings that you had when you went into it, when you were coming out? How do you think the other person felt at different moments within the conversation? Just try and just, if you have the wherewithal, just jot down some reflections on that. I will then invite you, if you wish, to share some aspects of that conversation in the chat. And again, it's not, you don't need to share the detail, but it's about kind of what was going on for you, perhaps. So we'll have a couple of minutes of silence while you do that. And then I'll invite you to share what you feel comfortable sharing. So if you're still thinking, reflecting, remembering a conversation, please do continue with that. But anybody who's ready might like to think, okay, what do I want to share about this? What were the feelings perhaps that I was aware of in myself, in the other person? And we already have two lovely generic examples of what tends to happen, which is great. And if you also want to be thinking kind of what were the What was the specifics of that conversation? What do I remember about the feeling that I had? That would be lovely, either to speak or to share in the chat. Yeah, that's a really powerful example. Talking to somebody who's essentially denying climate change, not that it's not happening, but that it's not caused by humans, and the rage that you might feel, and how and a sense perhaps of helplessness. You know, where do I even start with that? I remember having a conversation with a not exactly a colleague, but somebody who was on a course I was on, and she said, "Well, I think we just don't know. I don't know. I don't see how we can know whether climate change is happening or not." She was kind of talking about it in a way that made me feel she was almost like denying the science basis. And I found myself saying, so if I said to you that we don't know whether gravity exists, what would you say to that? And she was furious because she felt really insulted by what I was saying to her, which is essentially, you're a flat earther, you're denying the science. But I said that because it came out of a place of complete bafflement. How on earth do I begin this conversation? And I think that's often that may be very common if you're kind of expecting the other person to have at least the basis, a shared basis, and that's not there. And I want to be really clear about this. There are tools for this, but a lot of it is down to our own feelings and whether we can kind of hold on to ourselves enough to use the tools, and we'll explore the tools in a little while. But I don't want to make it sound as though it's all very straightforward, because if we're feeling kind of swept up in feelings, then that's the challenge. So we've also got a theme perhaps of issues around it moving very quickly from what's going on about climate to what do we do about it, and especially personal lifestyle choices. And people feel your expectation perhaps, or might be absolutely the truth, but we don't always know, that the other person or the other people are feeling guilty or feeling defensive because they expect you to be saying you should go vegan, you should stop eating meat, you should stop flying. And I think that can be quite a silencing effect as well. And then also perhaps the idea that perhaps if we look at those levels of climate conversations that I was talking about a minute ago, sometimes the ones in the middle can be actually a bit bland, or a bit as if there's no kind of emotion in them, because all we're doing is we're saying, oh yeah, climate change, oh yeah, it's bad, isn't it? And we don't know where to go from there. So lots of fantastic examples, and that's a lovely example that's just come up on the chat. So realizing that you just want to win the argument, and realizing also that that's not effective. And then the question of how do we behave if we don't want to just win the argument? What else can we do? And recognizing that there is a lot of emotion in this for many of us. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I don't think there is I'm not here to say I know how to do this and I'm going to tell you and you are going to start doing it. It's about exploring, it's about allowing our own emotions perhaps, and also finding a place where we can perhaps deal with the emotions so that we're feeling a bit better equipped to have a conversation that might be slightly less dominated or mobilized by our emotions. So, and then looking again here, being concerned about other people's anxiety, especially young people and children, and especially if it's your own children. And I think it is helpful to take advice about this, but it is also it's also perhaps about allowing the anxiety, and that can sometimes be difficult when it's your own children, because we kind of want to fix it, want to make it all right for them. Okay, these are lovely examples, and thank you so much for sharing them in this context where, you know, I don't know whether any of you know each other, or whether it feels okay to do this. So I'm really grateful to you for bringing these powerful examples. Would anybody like to speak? Typing is one thing, but actually saying it out loud may be different.
Hi, Rebecca. I was just sort of thinking of an example. It's hard sometimes not to feel emotional when you are feeling passionate about a subject, but I've come across it quite a few times in my experience on the team. Sometimes you have to understand what the other person's beliefs are and what they and the place they're coming from, and it keeps you it sort of can keep you quite grounded in trying to understand that they're feeling just as passionate about what they're saying. And that can be quite important to just try and take yourself out of the situation, just try and see it from the other person's point of view. Easier said than done sometimes, but I found it has helped me personally in sort of sometimes just stepping back, trying to see it from their point of view and go, okay, we may not agree on this, you know, we'll agree to disagree, and then moving on. I think that's sort of sometimes helpful to how to deal with a situation like that can be confrontational.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And I couldn't agree more. And I also think, as you say, that can be difficult. And so perhaps there might be, we can explore this, but perhaps there might be situations in which actually what we need to do is not end it when we get to the point of we agree to disagree, but just spend a bit more time with the exploration. But we'll explore that together. What I would like to do now then is to share. Got a couple of hands up.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm Selina. I just want to say that it's even in the here and now, it's difficult to say something sometimes, isn't it? Because I think the topic, we're all connected by the topic, and there's lots of engagement on the chat. And but I think this format of not seeing each other, it makes it sometimes a bit complicated to dare to speak up, and that is probably what that's a kind of parallel process to what we're talking about climate change. Yeah, when do we talk? When do we speak up? Are we on our own? Are we talking to well, we don't know who listens to us and how. Yeah, into the dark.
That's a really powerful insight. Yeah. So and if I can just build on what you've just said, Selina, if I can invite us all to be making those kind of connections, you know, if you're feeling anxious or silenced or not sure what to say, or suddenly emotional in this workshop, try to reflect on what that how that echoes with your more face-to-face experiences of having these conversations. There's another hand. I am not very good at mine. Here it is. Speak.
So I was just thinking about a conversation I had a while ago with an older gentleman, a friendly acquaintance. So we were both in good spirits with it, but he was very much a climate denier. He's a retired electrical engineer of some sort, and he just sort of point blank said that CO2 is a neutral gas that he'd read in one of his sort of engineering magazines some time ago, that it just could not be causing climate change. And so I sort of, he didn't seem to be persuadable, and so I asked him what if I could present him with the evidence and what that it was a greenhouse gas, would he accept it? And he just sort of said no. And at that point, I kind of decided that it wasn't worth the conversation, and that unfortunately, maybe his generation isn't the one to persuade anyway.
That sounds like a painful decision to have had to reach.
Yes, I mean, we were both, you know, at the time, quite sort of nervous excitement to the conversation, but yeah, for me, it was just well, at this point, it's not worth continuing.
Yeah. And, you know, there will be many of those. And I think talking with climate deniers is, as we've been saying, is particularly difficult. But I think it might be worth. I still think there are things you can do with climate deniers that we can explore tonight. So what I'd like to do, if this is okay, is to move on to introduce a few ideas that I think may be helpful for informing how we go into these conversations. And Ali, if we could please have the next slide. Thank you. So this is a very rough and ready way of thinking about conversations that we have all the time, not climate conversations particularly, not necessarily even intense conversations. But the idea that in any conversation there will be the content, and the content are the words, and the words are what you see above the surface. This common metaphor of what's going on under the surface is to think about an iceberg. We can see very little of what's going on in a conversation if we just pay attention to the content, what's above the surface. What psychologists call the process in a conversation is the mood. So perhaps whether people are feeling a bit twitchy, a bit light-hearted, serious, excitable, edgy, curious, angry, anxious, all of those different feelings that can come and go in a conversation. And those are pretty visible because they are pretty close to the surface. You can feel your own feelings, your own mood, and that may also tell you something about the mood of the other person. It's not completely reliable, but it's a good start. And we pick up all sorts of things from other people when we're especially in a face-to-face conversation. So mood is one aspect of process. Agenda is another aspect of process, and this has already been touched on in the examples. So if we go into a conversation and we think that actually afterwards what I was wanting to do there was to win the argument, that was my agenda, or to persuade the other person, or even, you know, kind of perhaps a little shamefully, we wanted the other person to feel bad. We wanted the other person to feel that they're a bit of a slob, or they're a bit lazy, or they haven't been paying attention enough. Those are all things that I know that sometimes I feel when I'm having climate conversations. There's something about wanting to win. Not all the time, and also sometimes there might be other aspects of agenda, like we might know that we want the other person to feel that we're interested in them, that we are concerned for their well-being. But often there are aspects of agenda that we're not quite so aware of at the time, and we may reflect later that we were using an agenda that perhaps wasn't very helpful. And then finally, another aspect of process is the perceptions that we might each bring to a conversation. So, for example, I have, it's easier now, but 10 years ago, when my son was in his late adolescence, when he was just coming up to leaving school, we would have quite a lot of conversations about climate change, in which I think that what was going on in terms of perception was me seeing him as an unthinking, selfish, lazy adolescent who didn't really care about the planet, was only cared about his having fun with his friends. I do love him, but these feelings are there sometimes as well. And he saw me as a tedious, environmentally obsessed, middle-aged woman who was basically telling him to get his act together. And so all those aspects of the relationship that we already have, which is, as I say, much better now, but when your children are going through adolescence, there are those kind of quite nasty things, as well as all the love and affection and connection, and those were perhaps part of the conversations that we had. In a sense, it was like I was telling him to tidy his room, and he was really tired of me telling him to tidy his room. So it leaked into everything. And I think we can really see those perceptions, or we can certainly make assumptions about them. And it's a bit of an issue with conversations about climate, isn't it? Because there's all this stuff about what's the identity that we carry around with us, whether we like it or not. We are the person who is concerned about climate. If we're an activist or somebody who's trying to do the right thing in our own lives, that is seen by others, and it can often it can be a problem. It can create an expectation that we're going to be saying something to them which is criticizing them. So that's the kind of basis for a lot of what I want to talk about this evening. And this is an idea you can take into any conversations. Many of you will be familiar with it as a concept, or with things like it. And what I'm going to be asking us to do is to try to pay attention to what is under the surface, so the process rather than the content. If we could have the next slide, please. Because one of the things that makes climate conversations very difficult is that it's full of defences. And the thing about defences is that they're what we need to use to deal with very difficult feelings. And defences are basically how humans manage very difficult feelings, and everyone has them. They're not just about climate deniers, or people who don't want to make changes in their lives. They're there, and we use them to manage difficulties all the time. But there are some fairly specific defences in relation to the climate crisis. And I think I use this image on this slide because I think it's quite helpful to remember that defences arise when we feel vulnerable, when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel taken back to the early weeks and months of our lives, because we're facing something so huge. And really, I think what's helpful to remember is that those of us who are concerned about climate are not the only ones who are having to deal with the hugeness of it. Others are also facing that. And so what we're about in these conversations may be to reach out to the vulnerability and if you like, kind of roll with the defences that people are having to use. They're coping mechanisms, perhaps. So if we can have the next slide, I'll show you what I mean by specific defences in terms of climate. So Ali, this is a slide which has got various transitions, so I'll just tell you when I want you to move on to the next one. And if we can have the first transition, please. So splitting. Splitting is a universal defence. It comes from very, very early in our lives. It essentially means putting something unbearable somewhere else, taking the unbearable aspects of a feeling and splitting it off from the positive. And in climate, I think what you have is this example. You may be familiar with this particular meme. Of the dog in a burning cafe, and what is going on here in terms of splitting is there is this huge apocalypse. Everything is on fire. That's the terrifying aspect, then we create a very small and a very manageable and almost frivolous response, which is let's ban straws. And I'm sure we're sick and tired of seeing these kinds of responses to climate. But what I think is helpful to remember is that the turning it into an apocalypse may also be an aspect of the splitting. So let's try and find where we can manage the actual reality now, and enable ourselves to move away from the splitting mentality by thinking, okay, what is actually happening now? Yes, there are wildfires. Yes, there is terrible stuff happening. But let's not turn it into literally the end of the world, because that's not where we are yet. So it's finding ways of not being stuck in the splitting mentality. If we can have the second transition, please, Ali. So the second idea about defences to climate feelings is projection, and everybody here will be really familiar with the way in which, as in fact was said in the chat, the whataboutery. What about Trump? What about China? What about India? What about all those people who are not doing anything, all those countries that are not doing anything? It's not our fault. It's not the UK's fault. It's not my fault. It's not my responsibility. I'm going to put it all over there. But of course, this happens the other way around too, that we may idealise certain people and certain groups. So Greta Thunberg, I think, comes in for a lot of idealization. David Attenborough comes in for a lot of idealization, and this is about saying all the good is in that person and all the bad is over there. So again, it's how can we find a place where we can see the good and the bad, the wish to do something, the wish to take responsibility, and the wish to just hide under the duvet in all of us. So the third transition is what's known as disavowal, what you might call compartmentalizing. And this is not that different from the let's ban straws while the world burns first example. But I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of compartmentalizing, because it's something we may all be prone to, that we are taking it seriously. This tweet from the UK Prime Minister's climate spokeswoman from earlier this year. Yes, we have big asks. Yes, we need to stop digging up coal. We need to transition to electric vehicles. We need to plant millions of trees. But the micro matters too. But somehow the micro becomes the thing that I do. So not rinsing dishes before I put them in the dishwasher becomes my contribution to this huge thing. And it makes it manageable. There's nothing wrong with it as long as we don't get stuck in it. And it's about being able to cope rather than getting stuck in this sense of the world's ending. So if we could have the last transition, please, Ali. Just a reminder, we've all got this. This is going on for all of us, and we need to do it. So this is not about saying there's something wrong with defences. But one of the things about defences is they don't respond well to being battered. They don't respond well to being told you're being defensive or you're wrong, or here's a completely different perspective. The way in which we can work with defences is to play with them a little bit, and to be gentle and respectful of them, not running away, not saying, okay, we won't talk about this, but just allowing the person to explore for themselves what's going on, what kinds of defences they may be experiencing. There are a couple more slides, and if we could just have the next one, please, Ali. And yeah, this is just a pointer for some useful reading. Sally Weintraub has recently published this really good book. She's an academic and a psychotherapist, but she writes in a way that I find very engaging and easy to read. And this book is essentially saying, remember that we've all got we're all complex human beings with caring parts and uncaring parts. And the trouble at the moment is that our culture seems to foster the uncaring parts. So it's not that there are caring people and uncaring people. We've all got both in us. And the trouble is, if our society is encouraging us to prioritize the uncaring parts, so to say, I deserve that holiday, that long haul flight. I'm really tired at the end of the week. I deserve a burger. I don't care what the effect of that is. Those are things that we can manage if we're supported to do so. But if we're not supported, it doesn't support us to allow the caring part to have more of a role, then it wouldn't be surprising then if we're going to be those people who reply to surveys about taking action on climate change by saying, I haven't got the headspace, I can't do that, I'm not going to take action, which we saw recently, we saw this week. And yes, Thomas, that your point in the chat there about most people thinking that recycling is taking sufficient action, and I think that's an example of a failure to educate, that people don't actually know that recycling is not anywhere near enough. But it's also maybe that kind of fostering of, well, so long as I mostly put things in the right bin, then it's okay. I think that's what we're going on here. Yeah, and thank you also, Rob, for the reference to George Monbiot. May I swear on this on this Teams? MCB stands for Micro Consumerist Bollocks, which it is. But let's also be kind of forgiving of what of the choices that people feel constrained to make, which I think is what this is about, really. And I want to say one last thing before we move into more of a conversation. If we could have the next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. I think my sense from how you've introduced yourselves is that many of you are working in climate, either professionally or as activists, or as volunteers, just doing what you can. And I want to say something from my own research about why climate work is challenging, and it is challenging. We have climate feelings. We're also part of all the socially organised defences against them, and the silence that is part of that. We're working in an extremely polarised setting. And we may feel under attack a lot of the time. And we may experience our own fear and other people's fear of that. And the sense of exclusion that comes with it. I think too that people working on climate are may be aware of and conscious of and very concerned about the shame that comes from our colonial past and our industrial past, especially in the UK and surrounding countries, of what we have done to the planet, and that because that shame is denied by others, often it actually intensifies in those who are aware of it. So that makes the work harder, I think. And of course, the overwhelming urgency and the sense of personal responsibility. And we're the ones who are feeling this stuff, and so that means that other people don't need to, and so that makes it, I think, even harder. Now, and so why I'm saying that is that if you are working in climate and you're struggling with some of those things, please get help. Please make time for yourself. Please do practice self-care, but also, really importantly, find other people that you can talk to about this stuff, because processing feelings helps us to recover from the attacks and from the experiences of shame and anxiety and so on. And there are increasing resources available for this, which will be in the slides at the end. So that's the theoretical bit of today. And what I'd like to do now is, if we could have like 5 or 10 minutes for you to say what you make of what I've said so far, and then in the second half we'll move on to putting some ideas of how you respond to these defences into practice. Again, please use the chat or speak. Speaking is great. If, as Selina said earlier, we may need to break the taboo here as well. While you think what you want to say, I'm just flicking through the chat. Thomas, thank you for the middle 60% comment. I think that's absolutely right. I think the effort that we may need to, the emotional effort that we may need to bring to talking to climate deniers may not always be worth it. But if those climate deniers are in our family, there may be something that we need to think about in terms of the relationship with that person that we might be able to explore later. Robert, your hand's up.
Hi, yeah, it's actually just on that point. We had a recent presentation by Chris Boardman, who's the Transport Commissioner for Greater Manchester, and he talks about the noisy 20%, the 20% who will never be convinced that what you're doing is worthwhile. And his method for dealing with it is to turn it back into a question, and to actually, once you've turned it back into a question, it's back on them then to respond. There's no need for you to try and refute what they're saying. You're asking, well, what would you do to solve this problem?
It's really nice, yeah. And assuming they're not deniers, but there's a kind of these solutions are not the right ones kind of response, and I think that could work very well. But perhaps there's also different kinds of questions that could be asked, and we can explore those as well. What other thoughts? Anything that wasn't clear or that you don't agree with in what I've been saying? Thomas.
Thanks, Rebecca. I guess I'm just interested, really, I'm following up on the Leo Barassi point about apathy. If he's correct, and he seems like he's researched it quite thoroughly as some sort of pollster, the majority of people in Western countries, including the UK, do accept that climate change is real. But there seems to be a lot of confusion around the question of, so what actions are sufficient to address it? And I think that's a really difficult problem because it encompasses so many areas of our life, like transport, the food we eat, how we heat our homes, etc. I don't know if you've got any thoughts later on around this kind of apathy question.
Thank you. I think it's a really important point. Ronnie Litzman, who is a climate psychologist, long-standing climate psychologist within the Climate Psychology Alliance, and so within that kind of field of what we might call depth psychology, wrote a book, was it about 5-10 years ago, called The Myth of Apathy, which is in which the idea is that it's not apathy in the sense of can't be bothered. It's actually apathy as a defence, because the idea being that if we open ourselves up to the scale of the climate problem, And in her case, the people she was researching were experiencing environmental degradation in around the Great Lakes in America. So if we open ourselves up to the grief of that, and if we open ourselves up to the anxiety about the scale of the problem, then we will not cope, and so we will say, this is nothing I can do, it's not possible to do anything, and it looks like apathy, but it's actually masking some very strong feelings. And so the ideas that I work with are about helping people to connect in a caring way to some of those difficult feelings, so that we're not actually talking about focusing on solutions, certainly not about pushing solutions at people, but recognizing the difficulties, recognizing the fact that sometimes the personal choices are very difficult in a system that doesn't encourage them, and that we may really want to do those things, but it's very difficult with everything else that's going on in our lives. And so we focus in on what are those difficulties, what are those feelings that people have got about feeling like, I'm not just one person in this huge system, what on earth am I supposed to do? And I want to pick up on Julia's point. Thank you, Julia. I acknowledge that you're waiting for your children to sleep, and so you need to be quiet. And thank you for saying that, because I think that really brings us into the kind of experience of being at home and thinking about this stuff, and feeling that you need to control yourself and your responses. Absolutely, there is a need to be able to manage ourselves in these conversations. And I would just say to you, please don't feel that you have to do that on your own, because a lot of what's needed here is someone else to process the feelings with, so that you're better equipped when you're talking to somebody that you find difficult. And I also wanted to pick up on the comment before that about how if we talk about climate change, that kind of almost activates difficult responses. So calling it climate change is a problem. If we can park climate change and turn it around to doing the right thing, maybe that helps. And I would turn that around a little bit, because I completely agree that often naming climate change brings up all sorts of defensive reactions. And what I would say is, what we can do about that is to name it. So we can say, I know, like, if this is somebody that you've had these conversations with a lot, or you begin to have the conversation, then you both stop because you just kind of don't want to go there again. It's possible to say something like, we seem to struggle to talk about this. We seem to find it difficult to kind of have any meaningful conversations about this subject. I wonder why that is. Then actually sometimes that opens up a more meaningful, more powerful kind of discussion, and which at the end might come to the other person talking about what they want to do and what they see the right thing as. But I also think that talking about doing the right thing can activate some equally defensive responses. That people feel that I'm seen as not doing the right thing. That's really quite a painful thing to be to feel. So they will say, I can't, or well, you think it's the right thing, but I don't, and the defenses come up. Okay. Should we have a couple of minutes of comfort break, doing whatever you need to do to kind of come back in a couple of minutes, ready to think about what are the things we can do about this stuff. Just mute if you haven't already, and we will reconvene at exactly 25 to 8 UK time. Just a couple of minutes. And Ali, if you'd like to stop sharing your screen for now. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back if you left. The first thing I'd like to do is, if possible, is for us to watch a little video together. And this, Ali, if you could share your screen again, we'll see if we can get the video to work. Oh. You've obviously been ahead of me. So can we need you to unmute yourself, I think.
Yes, hang on one sec. Let me try that again because I don't think I've shared my sound.
Talking about climate change can be tough. I mean, it's not like something you can just casually bring up in conversation. But it's such a big, important topic, we can't just ignore it. And while you can't fix climate change all by yourself, you do have the power to affect the people in your life. So let's talk more about climate change. Here's how. First, think about all the things you want to say about climate change. And don't say them. Really. You see, if you just start going off on how bad climate change is, people are probably going to shut down. They may feel attacked and put up their guard. It doesn't matter how eloquent your words are. If the other person's not listening, there's no point. So here's the secret to talking about climate change. Listen. Listen to the other person. I know it sounds weird, but it's the most important part. You may think the goal is to convince the other person of your perspective, but that's going about it all wrong. The goal is just to have an actual conversation, and that only happens when people listen. So, how do you start? First of all, don't ambush people. Get permission first. If they're busy, no need to force it. Just try again another time. Distractions make talking hard, so it's okay to ask to shut devices off. Once you have their attention, start with a question about climate change. Remember to make it about them, not you. Ask about their thoughts and their perspective. When they start speaking, you have one job. Just listen. Resist any urge to respond right away. And whatever you do, don't interrupt. This might be the hardest part, especially if you have strong feelings or if the other person is saying something that you disagree with. But trust me on this. Just listen and be open to what they're saying. Now, if the other person doesn't say much, that doesn't mean you can go, okay, they're done, my turn. It's not your turn until you learn something about the other person. So encourage them to say more by asking follow-up questions. Ask about personal experiences. No need to go into science or politics. Reflect back what you hear them say. Repeating and referring to their words lets them know that you are listening, that you care about their point of view. This makes them feel valued and safe. When you earn their trust, they will be more willing to open up and listen to you. So, after they've shared their perspective, then ask if you can tell them about yours. Okay, now it's your turn. What will you say? Remember, the point is not to convince the other person of anything. If you try to do that, they may become defensive and stop listening. Just share what you personally think about climate change. You may not be a climate expert, but you are the expert on yourself. So tell your story. When did you start caring about climate change? What worries you the most? After you're done talking, ask what they think. Bring it back to them. And, you guessed it, listen. That's what a conversation is, a two-way exchange of ideas. Go back and forth for as long as it feels right. Learn from one another. At the end, thank them for talking and say what you learned from them. This is important. Ending on a positive note makes it more likely that this conversation will happen again. You see, one little chat may not change anyone's life, but it opens the door to more climate conversations in the future. And that's how you build trust. Get others caring about climate change and make a long-term impact. You may be surprised how much you learn in the process too. So, what are you waiting for? talk to someone about climate change. It may be one of the most important things you do.
I think you're on mute, Rebecca.
Sorry, I've just realised I've been speaking and muted. Thank you very much, Ali, for managing the technology so nicely. And that video was from the Alliance for Climate Education, and Ronnie Litzman, who I mentioned before the break, was the advisor on the content. And I know it's American and sometimes that puts people off, but it's also aimed at young people, but I actually think it's an incredibly powerful video. And one of the messages that I take away from it is I think we often don't listen as much as we think we do. And so that kind of, yeah, no, it's not your turn yet. Keep listening. It's not your turn until you've learned something about the other person. That is a massive discipline, and something that all of us, I think, could really practice, including myself in this. What responses do you have to that video? What applying it to the conversations that you were thinking about earlier on? How might it help, or what are you kind of wondering about in relation to that straightforward, simple idea about listening and asking questions?
I'm happy to come in, Rebecca, because I watched that video when we were chatting initially about you coming to talk for us. And I think I was doing some research and I came across it, and I've used it twice now. I've used the tools in that video twice, and I have to say they really do work. Particularly, well, there's a couple of things. One is waiting for them to finish talking and then hone in on something they've just said, and then repeat that back to them in a way that kind of talks more about where you're coming from a little bit, and I find that has worked, but I wouldn't underestimate the listening. That's the biggest thing I think I took from that video, and it seems to be the biggest thing that's worked for me.
Thank you. And the £5 in the post. Any other responses? Anybody feeling skeptical about it? I think just picking up what Gemma said, one of the things that can stop us listening is fear, and another one is wanting to win. And I think both of those can be going on at the same time. So we may not listen because we're thinking, oh my God, they just said something climate denialist, or that we may get caught up in pre-existing relationship stuff like I was describing with my son. Or we may actually be part of used to a feeling where actually we just want to win the conversation, and so we're just waiting for it to be our turn. Lots of things can go on there, but it's about practicing, and often if we're thinking, oh, what am I going to say next? I don't know what to say. This listening thing can be really powerful and useful, because if we don't know what to say, well, that's fine, because we don't have to say anything. So just keep listening, just keep asking. And the point in the chat about this is a big time commitment, that is exactly right. And this is a massive dilemma in climate work, because what we're often feeling is the clock is ticking. We all need to do everything we can possibly do right now, like, last year, 20 years ago. And so it's really difficult to slow down, to listen, to build a relationship. But I'm proposing that is exactly what we have to do. we don't browbeat, we don't shout, we actually listen and build relationships. Now, this may not be what we need to do if, in fact, we feel that this is a situation in which we just need to make a strong statement. And that might well be in kind of politics and advocacy and so on. That's I'm not saying that in all climate situations we just need to listen, but having it as a part of our toolkit can be massively useful, especially perhaps when we're dealing with elected representatives, you know, who are used to being shouted at, and so actually getting a kind of undermining of their expectations by just being really interested in what they've got to say might work. You never know. Okay, so Ali, if we can have the slides again, and it should be slide 13. Thank you. So this is an iceberg that's been turned upside down. And I mean, I have no idea how that could have happened, but this is a real image of a real flipped iceberg. So this is the idea that we're going back to that idea of process. So mood, agenda, perceptions, making it visible, talking about it, and that's. I mean, if we don't do anything else, I think that can be a really powerful tool that we can use. So just kind of naming stuff, like I was saying before the break, if we're used to struggling with climate conversations with one particular person, or even just generally, we can say, you know, often I feel really anxious when I'm talking about climate with people, or I notice we don't talk about it much, or when we do, this kind of thing happens. Talking about the process can really start to open things up. So that's the first bit of the first suggestion. If we can have the next slide. So we've already had the listen from the video. And then there are two things in this slide that I think are important. One is that is recognizing that we are all ambivalent about, especially around actions that we might think we're being encouraged to take around climate. Any kind of change evokes ambivalence in people. And when I say ambivalence, I don't just mean resistance. I mean, you know, yes, I think it's terribly important, but I've got this issue with it, or I don't know that, or I'm struggling with feelings of despair, it's probably too late, or I've got a lot of stuff going on in my life at the moment and I haven't got space for this. I'm confused about the advice. So and also the taboo, so please don't spoil my day with this. That's all of those things are indications perhaps of ambivalence, and I think it's about being kind of respectful of people's ambivalence, and acknowledging your own, because with these projections the risk is that you are the saint, the climate saint who has done all the right things, and they are the climate sinner who hasn't done any of them, when the fact is it's going to be somewhere in the middle for both of you. There'll be things you haven't managed to do yet, or things that you haven't got the scope for, and some of that might be about ambivalence, or it might just, you know, there might be kind of practical reasons, but recognizing that we all struggle with this and acknowledging it with the other person can be very powerful. So that's one thing. And then looking out for signs of resistance, which might be people agreeing with you very quickly, or, you know, that kind of let's agree to disagree thing. It's kind of, I don't want to talk about this. And again, you know, it's not about pushing through against the resistance, but it's about saying, naming the fact that it might be difficult, noticing that it feels difficult to have this conversation, and trying to notice what the feeling is that might be going on for them. So, you know, it sounds like you feel is a way of guessing the feeling that they might be having, and checking in with them. You know, if someone says the advice keeps changing, you can say it sounds like it feels a bit overwhelming, or it sounds like it's very confusing. You don't have to use the F word with people who don't do that. That's fine. You can use other language, but asking questions that address the process is what this is about, I think. And you have some examples there of words that you can use. So that's no, I don't think I do. Yeah, so we're not talking about arguing, we're not talking about retaliating, we're talking about working at this process level and really listening and asking questions that address that. So I have an example which it would be just great to spend a bit of time looking at together. The next slide, please, Ellie. You may have your examples, but this is the one that I've been using, and I find it seems to resonate with people. So say you're in a conversation and someone says defensively and ambivalently, I'd like to use the bus more, but it takes so long, the times are so inconvenient, or things like I've got multiple journeys to make and I need to take the kids to school and then go to work, and that it just wouldn't be possible on the bus. So what you've got there on the slide is examples first of the kinds of things we might more naturally say, or we might be drawn to say, but which might be less helpful in this kind of conversation. So providing information, timetables have improved, or using your own experience as a kind of illustration of it works, it can be done, or being a bit, what's the word, a bit smug about it. I think we have to put our own convenience to one side when we're thinking about climate change. So those first three, I think I would say, don't use those, at least not until you get to the point where the person is asking for and thinking about information. Don't ever use number 3, I think. But 1 and 2 can be used, but just not at the beginning of a conversation. And so 4, 5, 6, and 7 are alternatives. Number 4 is about addressing the ambivalence. You're not saying the person hates buses. You're saying you don't always like it, maybe. Or you're encouraging them to talk about difficult experience of using buses. Or if you want to be more positive, encouraging them to kind of think, yeah, what would it be like if this really worked well? Or if you're noticing that what is under the surface in what they've been saying is a sense of being pressured all the time, too much, and with not enough time for anything, going to that. So 4 options, which you would need to put into your own words, but which may be a way of kind of exploring this kind of issue. So I'll stop speaking, and if you could stop sharing the slide, Ali. Question now then is, can we take an example from a conversation that you've been having and see if we can develop a set of responses which might be useful to try. So would anybody like to volunteer a conversation that they've been wondering about? Ideally a real conversation, and something about what the other person said, and then we can think together about how what might be a helpful response. And we'll just do that for maybe 10 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for more of a discussion and just Q&A. Is there a hand up? Yeah, Julie. Julie, I think you may need to unmute.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, so I was in work this morning, and a colleague who knew that I was sort of interested in climate change said, "Oh, it's this climate change thing. What can I do?" So we talked a bit. We mentioned we've both got electric bikes, but she lives somewhere that it's difficult to get through traffic and so on. And I think I sort of shied away from saying, "Well, you could," or "What do you think?" And we ended up talking about, we need better cycle tracks and things. And then we had to move on. We were distracted, and the conversation didn't continue. So afterwards, I wondered whether, maybe it's something I could pick up another time with her and have maybe a more meaningful conversation. So any comments or suggestions from anyone would be very helpful.
What a fabulous example, and how lovely to have it kind of given to you on a plate,
And then I felt I didn't respond because I was a bit taken aback, and with my whole worry about, well, I don't want to be preachy, I don't want to tell her what to do, and I got in a bit of a sort of slight inner panic about it.
And that's happened to me too, Julie, with my daughter-in-law, and I recognise that kind of, I better be careful here, I need not to be preachy. So okay, so what do we think? It sounds as if you had a really good conversation, so let's this is not about fixing something, but how could it be even better next time? What do you think would be a good way to start it? So she says, "What can I do?" Let's go back to that conversation about what I can do. What would be a good first response?
Well, I think maybe I don't know. I probably wouldn't use these words, but this meaning. What might be something about, that's kind of great that you want to do stuff, and what sort of thing were you thinking of? Or I don't know, something like that maybe. Without sounding condescending, and kind of have it as a conversation, of which our discussion about bikes might have been part. But I felt what I did, which is what I've noticed I've done before, is I almost pulled back from it because of my fears of saying the wrong thing or in the wrong way. Mm-hmm. Plus, we have very limited time. So making maybe more of a conversation.
Asking
what you're obviously worried about this. What are what are your concerns? Kind of a conversation.
I think that would be really good. Yeah. And so it may be that she's. You don't know whether she's worried, of course, but you could say, "It sounds like you're worried. It sounds like your concerns are quite strong. So tell me a bit more about that." Or what are you thinking about? And get her to say those things, and maybe then move into what. Okay, so it's another question, but it will be something like, "What are you already doing?" One of the aspects of that is that it builds people's sense of that can do something. So you already know she has an electric bike, of course, but you could say, "I know you've already got an electric bike. What else are you doing? What else, or what else are you considering?" What other suggestions do people have about what Julie could say, or just not just what she could say, but kind of approach to take, or suggestions about how to hold the conversation? I feel like there's a lot of expertise in this room.
I think it's also for me, should I kind of pick it up again? And if I do, how do I do it? The way that I work, we have this kind of 5 minutes here and there, there's not necessarily opportunities for long conversations.
Yeah. So what do you think about, if you think about conversations where you have felt, okay, this is quite important, need to make time for it, or need to have a proper conversation about this, what have you done make that happen? Not necessarily about climate.
Yeah, I suppose if it was something I wanted to discuss with somebody particularly, which would maybe be more of a work-based thing, I would sort of say, well, I could be catching you about something, can we put some time aside? Now, whether I feel I could do that in terms of this conversation, yes, I don't know.
You can only ask, can't you?
I know, I probably just need to be bolder.
I mean, I think the video had some suggestions for that, didn't it? You know, about making time. Yeah. So Rob's suggesting arrange a time out of work if that's doable. Or I don't know if you ever get lunch breaks, but should we eat our sandwiches together and talk about?
Yeah, no, I think I should do. I tend to, as I say, sort of shy away from things with thinking, well, I don't want to kind of be, you know, people think I'm a bit of a fanatic. But yeah, I do want it. They are conversations I want to have, and I guess I want to be bolder about them.
Is there a hierarchy between you? Are you more senior than her, or?
No.
Okay, so it is probably doable, isn't it, to suggest, you know, we had that nice conversation, but we didn't have enough time for it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think the other thing in terms of, because occasionally we're only a very small team, occasionally in team meetings I say things related to maybe we should be doing this climate change, and I tend to have become a bit of the, oh, here she goes again kind of person, you know. So again, I'm sort of wary of that. And I have said, and I know I will raise it again, you know, can we actually put it on the agenda and really have a proper conversations about this topic?
There's some good suggestions in the chat about making the two of you rather than about her. You know, kind of sharing the problem solving, as it were. And yeah, the question about not feeling safe on the bike, just asking her to talk a bit more about that. But I think what we've got is setting up the conversation on the one hand and having the conversation on the other hand, and all of those are great suggestions for having the conversation. And I would say, you know, just ask to have it, and it doesn't need to be formal, you know. So what else about this? Yeah, so if you were saying a minute ago that you feel as if you might be seen as the person who's always going on about this, and what I sometimes find is helpful is to name that with the other person. You know, to say, I think I've got a bit of a reputation, or I seem to be the person who is always the one going on about climate. But I'm not, you know, I don't want to do that. So can we just talk about it in a more open way? And if you find I'm going on at you or telling you what to do, then just tell me and I'll stop.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's naming what's going on. Okay. Thank you, Julie, for volunteering. I think that was a really, really helpful example. And the invitation now is just maybe, Rose, you would like to pick this up, and just if people have got questions in a general sense, now's the time to raise them. And maybe if I can just say all the best with your practicing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for the very, very amazing session. I think you've already had some people thanking you for it. I found it really, really useful in like day to day. And it's also very reflective of myself It's a lot of understanding myself and what are the issues that I'm facing when I'm talking about climate change, as well as understanding the other person and not going straight into the conversation, but taking some time to understand what is it they're talking, what's their mood, what's the background before going into the real conversation. And sometimes you might not get there and you pick it up another time. I think it's super valuable. Just to everyone else, I think, yes, we did say it was going to end now, but then, we could have a couple of minutes if anyone had any questions they want to ask about the session. You can either put your hand up or type it in the chat function. Is Julie, is your hand up from previously?
Yes, no, it's not supposed to be.
No, that's okay.
Thank you.
I think for me, in my own personal experience, it's just how it quickly escalates and trying to kind of like not get it there first, because it's like I could be talking about, let's compost or let's grow our own garden, something really simple, and then it quickly goes to like, well, why we should be doing it, and then it suddenly goes to that, to like, it's our land is so small, our emissions are so small, let's, it's all it just goes straight to the other side, and it's like, how do you not get there so quickly? I think it sounds like it's an art and practice in conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, what I increasingly try to do when that happens is to kind of make a joke out of it, and because, oh no, we seem to be approaching the elephant of climate change, and then you can decide between you whether you want to talk about it or not. All
right, okay, yeah, that's a really, really good tip. I'll remember that for next time. It's just someone else, is Ashley saying, none of us wants to be the Debbie Downer. We need to try to keep things hopeful and optimistic. Yes, I agree as well, because if the conversation escalates, then you'll be the person who's always bringing the doom and gloom in the room, and you don't want to be that person.
Yeah, you don't want to be that person, and actually maybe the other person has their own doom and gloom, and so allowing that can be very powerful. And yes, let's be hopeful, let's be optimistic, but also let's allow the difficult feelings, because it doesn't work just to sit on them.
I agree. And Robert Mercer has just put in a comment about being reflective is a really useful takeaway. Understanding where the other party is coming from really helps. We need to recognize that sometimes we are in a bubble and a raft prior knowledge. That's absolutely right. And I think it's a really, like, that tool about listening, repeating and saying, I think it's really useful for any conversation. It's being genuine and wanting to listen to what that person has to say, and that practice of repeating means you really have to listen. That's a really useful tool.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, so ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of the workshop. So thank you so much, Rebecca. This is also our finale webinar. So we've had a few webinars since last week, and we've had really good speakers, and this is our last one. So thank you everyone who's joined us in all our sessions, or only just this one. We actually have an event tomorrow, which is full actually, where it's an in-person event where we're trying to start up conversations around climate change actually. So that will be really interesting to use some of these tools that we've learned today. So before we leave, do you have any last words? I know you just said a few words, but anything before we leave? And
let's forgive ourselves if we don't get it right, and let's be playful about not getting it right in the conversations, but also perhaps with ourselves afterwards.
Thank you. That is a really, really good advice. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. I think someone mentioned it being a topical. Thank you for maybe we can use all the COP26 being a topical over the next few weeks to start conversations. That's a good idea. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate what people have brought to the conversation and how everyone has been.
Lovely. Good evening.